At Sunday brunch, my grandmother proclaimed, "My real grandkids get the inheritance. You were always an afterthought." Everyone toasted to that. I didn't flinch, but I did contact the lawyer to reveal the secret codicil in her will that she'd forgotten about. I, 32M, should have known something was coming when my grandmother insisted on this particular Sunday brunch. The venue was too expensive, the guest list too specific, and her smile too sharp when she'd called to confirm I'd be there. But I went anyway, because that's what you do when you're raised to be polite, even when politeness has never been returned. The restaurant was one of those places with cloth napkins and servers who refill your water before you've taken 2 sips. My grandmother sat at the head of the long table, flanked by my uncle and aunt on one side, their 3 kids spread out like a perfect family portrait. My mother's chair, the one that should have been there, remained conspicuously empty, as it had been for the past 8 years since she died. I was seated at the far end, practically in a different zip code from the woman who'd raised my mother. My grandmother had always been a woman of theatrics. She waited until everyone had their mimosas, until the first course had been served, until the small talk had died down to that comfortable lull where people are just starting to relax. That's when she stood up, tapping her champagne flute with a knife like this was some kind of wedding toast. She announced that she wanted to discuss something important while everyone was gathered. My stomach tightened, but I kept my expression neutral. I'd learned that skill early. Never let them see they've gotten to you. She talked about family, about legacy, about the importance of blood and tradition. She spoke about my uncle's children, how wonderful they were, how they'd carried on the family name with such grace. She mentioned their accomplishments, college graduations, engagement announcements, career milestones. The table murmured in agreement, proud smiles all around. Then she turned to me. Her eyes, still sharp despite her 78 years, locked onto mine with something that looked almost like satisfaction. She said that while I'd always been part of the family in a technical sense, I'd never quite fit in the way her real grandchildren did. She emphasized the word real, as if I might have missed it otherwise. My grandmother explained that she'd been thinking about her estate planning, about what she'd leave behind when she was gone. She wanted to be clear about her intentions now, while she was still here to see everyone's faces. She declared that her real grandchildren would inherit everything. The house in Martha's Vineyard, the investment portfolio, the jewelry collection, the trust funds. She said I'd always been an afterthought, and she saw no reason to change that now. My uncle raised his glass first. He said something about how generous she was, how she'd always known what was right. My aunt joined in, her voice saccharine sweet as she praised my grandmother's wisdom. The cousins, all 3 of them, lifted their glasses with varying degrees of enthusiasm. The middle one at least had the decency to look uncomfortable, but he still drank when everyone else did. I didn't flinch. I'd had years of practice at this particular table, years of being the outsider, the reminder of my mother who'd never quite lived up to my grandmother's expectations. My mother had married for love instead of status, had chosen teaching over corporate law, had died too young in a car accident that my grandmother somehow managed to frame as one final disappointment. I took a sip of my water and told my grandmother that I understood completely. I thanked her for her honesty and for including me in this family announcement. My voice was steady, almost pleasant. I could see the confusion flicker across her face. She'd wanted a reaction, wanted tears or anger or some kind of dramatic scene she could hold over me for years to come. Instead, I finished my brunch. I even ordered dessert. I made polite conversation with the cousin who looked uncomfortable, asked about his new job, congratulated him on his recent promotion. I stayed until the very end, until my grandmother couldn't complain that I'd stormed out or caused a scene. When I left, I thanked her again for the meal. She looked almost disappointed. I waited until I was in my car, until I'd driven 3 blocks and parked in a grocery store lot, before I pulled out my phone. I had a number saved under a contact I'd labeled Simply Attorney. I'd had it for 3 years, ever since the day my mother's effects had been shipped to me, and I'd found a letter hidden in her jewelry box. The letter had been written by my mother 2 months before she died. In it, she'd explained something I'd never known, about a codicil to my grandmother's will, one that had been added 26 years ago, shortly after I was born. My grandmother had been different then, my mother had written, softer somehow. She'd had a moment of clarity, of genuine love for her daughter and new grandson. The codicil stated that 50% of my grandmother's estate would go to my mother or, in the event of my mother's death, to me directly. It was ironclad, drafted by the same attorney who'd handled my grandmother's affairs for 40 years. My mother's letter explained that my grandmother had made it during a period when she'd been on medication for a health scare, when she'd been forced to confront her own mortality and had wanted to make things right with her daughter. But my grandmother had apparently forgotten about it. The attorney had never reminded her, bound by the specific instructions she'd given at the time. The codicil was to remain sealed and unmentioned unless someone specifically asked about provisions for my mother or me. My mother had known about it because she'd been there when it was drafted, but she'd never told anyone else. She'd written in her letter that she'd hoped she'd never need to use this information, that she'd hoped my grandmother would change on her own. But my mother was dead, and my grandmother had just made her position crystal clear. The attorney answered on the second ring. He remembered me from the single meeting we'd had 3 years ago, when I'd first called him after reading my mother's letter. He'd confirmed everything, had shown me the paperwork, had explained that the codicil was legally binding and had never been revoked. He'd asked me what I wanted to do with the information. I told him I needed time to think about it. Now, sitting in that grocery store parking lot with the taste of expensive brunch still in my mouth, I told him I was ready. I asked him to file the necessary paperwork to make the codicil part of the official estate records. He said he'd have everything processed within the week. I went home and waited. 6 days later, my uncle called. His voice was tight, angry in a way I'd rarely heard. He demanded to know what I'd done, what kind of game I was playing. I asked him calmly what he was talking about. He told me that my grandmother's attorney had contacted her about a codicil in her will, something about my mother's portion of the estate. He said my grandmother didn't remember any such thing, that she was claiming it was a forgery, that I must have manipulated the situation somehow. I explained, in the same calm voice, that the codicil was legitimate, drafted and notarized 26 years ago by her own trusted attorney. I said that all the documentation was in order, that the law firm had maintained perfect records, and that my grandmother's signature, along with 2 witnesses, was clearly visible on every page. My uncle accused me of being selfish, of taking advantage of an old woman, of disrespecting the family. I reminded him about the brunch, about the toast, about being called an afterthought in front of a restaurant full of strangers. I asked him if he'd stood up for me then, if any of them had suggested that maybe, just maybe, completely disinheriting someone because they reminded you of your dead daughter was cruel. He hung up. My aunt called next, then my oldest cousin. They all said variations of the same thing. I was destroying the family. I was being greedy. I should think about what my mother would have wanted. That last one almost made me laugh. My mother had left me the information about the codicil. My mother had documented everything, had written me a letter explaining exactly what my grandmother had said when she'd added those provisions, how she'd wanted to make sure her daughter and grandson were taken care of no matter what. My mother had given me this option, and my grandmother had made my decision easy. The attorney called a week after my uncle's outburst. He said my grandmother wanted to meet. She was proposing a settlement, a one-time payment if I'd agree to waive my rights under the codicil. The amount he mentioned was substantial, probably a quarter of what I'd actually be entitled to, but enough to make most people seriously consider it. I asked him what would happen if I refused. He said we'd proceed with the codicil as written, that it was legally sound, and that my grandmother's estate would be distributed according to all valid documents, including the one she'd forgotten about. He mentioned that my grandmother was already speaking with other attorneys, looking for a way to challenge it, but he was confident in the document's legitimacy. I told him I wasn't interested in the settlement. My grandmother called me directly 2 days later. Her voice had lost some of its imperious edge. She said we needed to talk, that there had been a misunderstanding. She claimed she remembered the codicil now, said she'd been planning to update it, but hadn't gotten around to it. I asked her why she'd felt the need to make that announcement at brunch if she'd known about the codicil. Why the public humiliation if she'd understood that I was legally entitled to half her estate anyway. She didn't have a good answer for that. She tried a different approach, talking about family unity, about not letting money tear us apart. She said my mother wouldn't have wanted this, wouldn't have wanted me to cause problems. I reminded her that my mother had died knowing about the codicil, had left me all the information I needed to enforce it, and had never once suggested I should simply accept being treated as less than. My grandmother's voice hardened. She said I was being vindictive, that I was punishing her for being honest about her feelings. I told her that she was absolutely right. I was being vindictive. She'd spent 32 years making sure I knew I wasn't wanted, wasn't valued, wasn't really family. She'd held that brunch specifically to humiliate me one more time, to make sure I understood my place. I explained that I was simply accepting the gift my mother had left me, a gift my grandmother herself had created in a rare moment of genuine feeling. If she regretted it now, that was her problem, not mine. She threatened to fight it in court. I told her she was welcome to try, but that her own attorney had drafted the document, and every legal expert who'd reviewed it had confirmed its validity. I mentioned that a court battle would be expensive, time-consuming, and very public. I asked her if she really wanted all her society friends knowing about this particular family drama. The call ended without resolution. Update 1. It's been 3 months since that phone call, and the family dynamics have shifted in ways I didn't entirely anticipate. My grandmother did consult with 2 other law firms, and both apparently told her what her original attorney had already said. The codicil was legitimate, and challenging it would be both expensive and futile. She made one more attempt at a settlement, this time offering me 40% of the estate instead of the 50% I was entitled to. Her reasoning was that she'd grown the estate significantly over the past 26 years, and that growth shouldn't benefit someone who'd contributed nothing to the family legacy. I declined. The irony of her claiming I'd contributed nothing while simultaneously having excluded me from every opportunity to contribute wasn't lost on me. My uncle stopped speaking to me entirely. My aunt sent a long email about forgiveness and Christian values, which was particularly rich coming from someone who joined in that toast about me being an afterthought. I didn't respond. The middle cousin, the one who'd looked uncomfortable at the brunch, reached out. We met for coffee, and he apologized for not speaking up that day. He said he'd been shocked by my grandmother's announcement, but hadn't known what to do. He asked if there was any way to resolve this without tearing the family apart. I appreciated his honesty, but I told him the family had been torn apart long before I'd contacted the attorney. He'd just been comfortable enough in his position as a real grandchild that he hadn't noticed. He didn't argue with that. My grandmother's health started to decline. Nothing serious, just the normal progression of age, but it was noticeable. My uncle tried to use this as leverage, calling to tell me that the stress of the situation was killing her, that I'd have to live with that guilt. I asked him if he'd felt any guilt watching her systematically exclude me from the family for 3 decades. He hung up again. The strangest thing was how liberating the whole situation became. For years, I'd maintained a relationship with these people out of some sense of obligation, some hope that eventually they'd see me as family. My grandmother's brunch had freed me from that delusion, and enforcing the codicil had freed me from any remaining ties. I stopped attending family events. I blocked most of them on social media. I started building a life that didn't include people who only valued me when they thought I'd quietly accept their scraps. Update 2. 6 months after the initial brunch, my grandmother's attorney contacted me with a new development. My grandmother wanted to add a new codicil to her will, one that would effectively redistribute assets in a way that minimized what I'd receive. The attorney was calling as a courtesy to inform me that while she could certainly modify her will, she couldn't retroactively eliminate the codicil that had been in place for 26 years. However, she could donate significant portions of her estate to charity, restructure her assets in a trust that wouldn't be covered by the original codicil, or make other legal arrangements that would reduce the overall estate. The attorney wanted to know if I'd be interested in negotiating before she started moving assets around. I thought about it for a week. My mother's letter had included something I hadn't mentioned to anyone, a paragraph about what she'd hoped I'd do with any inheritance I might receive. She'd wanted me to use it to build something meaningful, to create opportunities for others the way she'd tried to do as a teacher. She'd mentioned her dream of establishing a scholarship fund for students from low-income families who wanted to become educators. I called the attorney back and proposed a compromise. I'd agree to a reduction in my percentage, from 50% to 35%, if my grandmother would agree to allocate 15% of her estate to establish a scholarship fund in my mother's name. The fund would be irrevocable, managed by an independent board, and would provide full tuition scholarships for students pursuing teaching degrees. The attorney said he'd present the offer. My grandmother rejected it. She said she wouldn't have her money used to glorify my mother's mediocre choices. She'd rather give everything to charity than see a penny associated with her daughter's name. That rejection clarified everything I needed to know. This had never been about the money, or about being fair, or about family unity. This was about my grandmother's inability to forgive my mother for being her own person, for choosing a life that didn't meet her standards, for dying and leaving me behind as a constant reminder of that disappointment. I told the attorney to proceed with enforcing the original codicil without any modifications. If my grandmother wanted to spend her final years moving assets around to spite me, that was her choice. But I was done negotiating with someone who hated my mother so much that she'd reject a scholarship in her name out of pure spite. Update 3. It's been a year now since that Sunday brunch. My grandmother turns 79 next month, and according to the family grapevine, which still occasionally reaches me through the middle cousin, she's become increasingly bitter about the entire situation. She did restructure some assets, but not as extensively as she'd threatened. Her attorney apparently advised her that too aggressive a redistribution could be challenged as an attempt to circumvent existing legal documents, which could actually strengthen my case if things went to court. The family has essentially split into factions. My uncle and his 2 older children remain firmly in my grandmother's corner, but the middle cousin has maintained his distance from the drama. My aunt stopped sending emails about forgiveness after I sent her a single response reminding her that she'd toasted to me being an afterthought. I used some of my savings to establish a small scholarship fund in my mother's name at her former school district. It's not the large-scale program I proposed to my grandmother, but it's a start. 2 students received funding this year, both aspiring teachers from families that couldn't afford the full cost of college. I attended their award ceremony, and one of them told me that my mother had been her favorite teacher in elementary school, that she'd inspired her to pursue education as a career. That moment meant more to me than any inheritance ever could. My grandmother hasn't contacted me directly since our last phone call, but she knows about the scholarship fund. According to my cousin, she was furious, claiming I was trying to manipulate public opinion and make her look bad. I wasn't trying to make her look any particular way. I was just honoring my mother's memory in a way that actually mattered. The legal situation remains unchanged. The codicil stands. My grandmother hasn't found a way to challenge it successfully, and eventually, when she passes, I'll receive what my mother wanted me to have. I've already decided that a significant portion will go toward expanding the scholarship fund. The rest will go toward building a life that my mother would be proud of, one that doesn't require the approval of people who never valued me anyway. Sometimes I think about that brunch, about the moment my grandmother raised her glass and declared me an afterthought. In her mind, she was putting me in my place, reminding me of my position in the family hierarchy. What she actually did was free me from caring about that hierarchy at all. The real inheritance my mother left me wasn't money. It was the permission to walk away from people who didn't value me, and the knowledge that I deserved better than being someone's afterthought. The codicil is just a legal document. The real legacy is knowing my mother loved me enough to give me a way out, and having the courage to take it. I don't attend family events anymore, and I don't miss them. I've built relationships with people who actually care about me, who don't require me to earn basic respect or constantly prove my worth. My grandmother wanted me to know I wasn't really family. I've accepted that, and I've never been happier. The cousins will get their inheritance. My uncle and aunt will get whatever my grandmother leaves them. And I'll get exactly what my mother wanted me to have, not just money, but freedom from a family that never deserved either of us in the first place. That's a legacy I can live with.